Hey guys, Sleepyhound Piper, back with Call of Cthulhu on our Eldritch December. Chapter 2, The Tale of Inspector Legrice. If you remember, this is the guy from Louisiana, New Orleans. Okay. Give me 1 second. The older matters, which have been made the sculptor's dreams, and the bas-relief so significant to my uncle, formed the subject of the second half of his long manuscript. Once before, it appears, Professor Angle had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity, puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphics, and heard the ominous syllables, which can be rendered only as Cthulhu. And all this is so stirring and horrible a correlation, or I think the word is supposed to be connection, but they spelled it weird. They put an X in it. that it is small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demand for data. The earlier experience had come in 1908. 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Angle, as befitted one of his authority and attainments, had been a prominent part in all the deliberations, and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convention to offer questions for correct answering and problems for expert solution. The chief of these outsiders, and in a short time the focus of interest for the entire meeting, was a commonplace-looking, middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legrice, and he was by a profession an inspector of police. With him, he bore the subject of his visit, a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette, which origin he was at a loss to determine. It must not be fancied that Inspector Legrice had the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, his wish for enlightenment was prompted by purely professional considerations. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured some months before in the wooded swamps south of New Orleans during a raid on a supposed voodoo meeting. And so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it that the police could not but realize that they had stumbled on a dark cult, totally unknown to them, and infinitely more diabolical than even the blackest of the African voodoo circles. The gris-gris and the veve and the stuffs. Of its origins, apart from the eccentric and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing was to be discovered. Hence the anxiety of the police for an antiquarian lore which might help them to place the frightful symbol, and through it track down the cult to its foundation head. I'm going to drink some more water. Okay. Inspector Legrice was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. And they misspelled created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement. And they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze at the diminutive figure whose utter strangeness and air of general abysmal antiquity hinted so potently on unopened and archaic vistas. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object. Yet centuries and even thousands of years seem recorded in its dim, greenish surface of unplaceable stone. The figure, which was finally passed slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height, of exquisitely artistic workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mess of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instant, with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of a somewhat bloated corpulency, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undescribable characters. The tips of the wings touched the back edge of the block. The seat accompanied the center, whilst the long curved claws of the double-upped, crouching hind legs gripped the foredge and extended a quarter the way down toward the bottom of the pedestal. The cephalopoid head was bent forward, so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the back of huge forepaws which clasped the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of the whole was abhorrently lifelike, and the more subtly fearful became its source was so totally unknown. Because its source was totally unknown. Its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable. Yet not one link did it skew from any known type of art, belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed to any form of time. Totally separate and apart, its very material was a mystery. For the soapy greenish-black soap, with its golden or iridescent flecks and saturations, resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present, despite a representation of half the world's expert learning in this field, could form the least notion of even their remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and the material, belonged to something horribly remote and distant from mankind, as we know it. Something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life, in which our world and our conceptions have no part. I'm going to drink some more water. And yet, as the members severally shook their heads and confessed defeat at the expector's problem, there was one man in that gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and writings, and whose presently told of which differences of the odd trife he viewed. This person was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology in Princeton University, an explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth, and whilst high up on the East Greenland coast had encountered a single tribe, or cult, of degenerate Esquimaux, whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other Esquimaux knew little, which they mentioned only with shudders, saying that it had come down from horribly ancient aeons before even the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain queer I can't even say it. Heredity rituals addressed to a supreme evil devil or Torsok. And of this, Professor Webb had taken a careful phonic copy from an ancient Anakok or wizard priest, addressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he knew how. But just now of prime substance was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and around which they danced when the aurora leapt high over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, comprising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing. And so far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. This data, received with suspense and astonishment by the assembled members, proved doubly exciting to Inspector Lagrange, and he began at once to pry his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested, he besought the professor to remember at best he must the syllables taken down amongst the diabolic Esquimaux. I know I'm saying it wrong, but it's fine. There were then followed an exhaustive comparison of details and a moment of really awed silence when both detective and scientist agreed on the visual identity, virtual, or visual, whatever, virtual, of the phrase common to both hellish rituals, so many worlds of distance apart. What in substance both the Esquimaux wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very like this, the words divisions being guessed at from traditional breaks in the phrases as chanted aloud. Flanugan, Fuatladen, Cthulhu, Lorelei, Fualal, Futhagen. Legrasse had at one point in advance of Professor Webb, for several among his mongrel prisoners had repeated to him what older celebrants had told them the words meant. This text, as given, ran something like this. In his house at Relais, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. And now, in response to the general and urgent demand, Inspector Lagrange related as fully as possible his experience with the swamp worshippers, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attached profound significance. It savored of the wildest dreams of mythmaker and theosophist, and disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination amongst such half-castes and pariahs as might be least expected to possess it. On November 1st, 1907, there had come to the New Orleans police a fanatic summoners from the swamp and lagoon country to the south. The squatters there, mostly primitive but good-natured descendants of Lafayette's men, were in the grip of stark terror from the unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known. Some of their women and children had disappeared since the maleficent tom-tom had begun its incessant beating far within the dark haunted woods where no dweller ventured. There were insane shouts and harrowing screams, soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames, and, the frightened messenger added, the people could stand it no more. So a body of 20 police, filling 2 carriages and an automobile, had set out in the late afternoon with the shivering squatter as a guide. And at the end of the passable road they alighted, and for miles splashed in the silence through the terrible cypress woods where day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones or fragment of rotting wall, intensified by its hint of morbid habitation. A depression which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. At length the squatter settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible far, far ahead, and a curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant even to be left alone again, each one of the cowed squatters refused point-blank to advance another inch toward the scene of unholy worship. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided into black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. I'm going to drink some more water. You can tell I don't talk a lot. The region now entered by the police was one of the traditionally evil repute. Substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge, formless, white polyplus thing with luminous eyes, and squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew out of the caverns and in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before D'Iberville, before Ir Salal, before the Indians, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was a nightmare itself. And to see it was to die. But it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was indeed on the merest fringe of the abhorrent area, but that location was bad enough. Hence, perhaps, the very place of worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legris's men as they plunged on through the black morass toward the red glare and the muffled tom-toms. There are vocal qualities particular to men, and vocal qualities particular to beasts, and it was terrible to hear the one when the source should yield the other. Animal fury and orgastic license were worshipped themselves to demonic heights by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods like pestilential tempests from the gulfs of hell. Now and then the less organized orations would cease, and for what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices would rise and sing-song chant that hideous phrase or ritual. Fi glui na furgal Cthulhu relay wargalachrol fratagen. When the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly into the sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into a frantic cry, which the mad cacophony of orgy fortunately deafened. Lagrange dashed swamp water on the face of the fainting man, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with horror. In a natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leapt and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormalities than any but a Siam or an Angrela could paint. Void of clothing, these hybrid spawn were baying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed in occasional rafts in the current flames, stood a great granite monolith some 8 feet in height, on the top of which incongruency with its geometrousness, rested the noxious carving statuette. From a wide circle of 10 scaffolds set up at regular intervals, with the flame grate monolith as the center hung. Head downward, the oddly mired bodies of the helpless squatters had been disappeared. It was inside this circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared, the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right, an endless bacchanal between the rings of bodies and the ring of fire. It may have been only imagination, but it may have been only echoes which induced one of the men, an excitable Spaniard, to fancy he had heard anthorial responses to the ritual from some far unillumined spot deeper within the forest of ancient legendry and horror. This man, Joseph de Golleris, I later met and questioned, and he proved distinctly imaginative. Distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of giant wings, and of a glimpse of shining eyes and a monstrous white bulk behind the remotest trees. But I suppose he had been hearing too much native superstition. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel celebrants in this throng, the police relied on their firearms and plunged determinedly into the noxious rout. For 5 minutes, the reluctant din and chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, escapes were made, but in the end, Lagrange was able to count some 47 sullen prisoners, whom he forced to dress in haste and fell into lines between 2 rows of policemen. 5 of the worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded ones were carried away on improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. The image on the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Lagrange. Examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners all proved to be men of very low mixed-blooded and mentally abhorrent type. Most were seamen, of a speckling of Negroes and mulattoes, largely West Indians or bravada Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands, giving a coloring of voodooism in the heterogeneous cult. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than Negro fashionism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprisingly consistently to the central idea of their loathsome faith. I want to state again, this is a dude who's very classist. His idea was anybody who wasn't part of his little culture had to be, fucked up. So, yeah. Also, this is the kind of fucking language that people used to use back in the day, which is wild. And well, actually, in his time period, people were still kind of greatly moving away from that. But he is the quintessential author of cosmic horror, so, you have to take some of it in stride. Just take his ideas and say, well, it's the dumbasses who think like this. It's not something you should take with you. Obviously, but, I have to mention it. Anyway, back on point. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones, who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world out of the sky. These old ones were gone now, inside the earth, under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first man, who formed a cult which had never died. This was the cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest, Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of Relay under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call, when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the consciousness things of earth. For shapes came out of the dark to visit the fateful few, but these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The craven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writings now, but things were told by word of mouth. The chant ritual was not the secret. That was never spoken aloud, only whispered. The chant meant only this: in his house at Relay, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged, and the rest were committed to various institutions. All denied a part in the ritual murders, and averred that the killing had been done by black-winged ones, which had come to them from their immemorial meeting place in the haunted wood. But of those mysterious allies no coherent account could ever be gained, and what the police did extract came mainly from immensely aged mystios named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cults in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of theologists and made men and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been eons when other things ruled on the earth, and they had great cities. Remains of them, he said, the deathless Chinaman had told him, were still to be found at Cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of time before man came, but there were ants which could revive them. I think the word is arts. There are arts which could revive them when the stars had come around again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. These great old ones, Castro continued, were not composed entirely of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not This star-fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not from matter. When the stars were right, they would plunge from world to world through the sky. But when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of Relay, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu, for glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time, some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserve them intact likewise prevent them from making an initial move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmuted through thought. Even now they talked in their tombs. When after infinities of chaos, the first man came, the great old one spoke to the sensitive among them by molding their dreams. For only thus could their language reach the fleshly minds of mammals. Then, whispered Castro, those men formed the cult around the small idols which the great one skewed them. Idols brought in dim auras from dark stars. That cult, which never die, will the stars come right again. Till the stars come right again. And the secret priest would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, were laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves. And the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of the return. Give me 1 second. All right. Wait a minute. Give me 1 more second. Okay. Yeah, we'll do that. In the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams, but then something had happened. The great stone city, Relay, with its monoliths and sculptures, had sunk beneath the waves, and the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, had cut away the spectral intercourse. But memory never died, and high priests said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, moldy and shadowy, and full of dim rumors picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of them, old Castro dared not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elect more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult, he said that he thought the center lay amidst the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Iram, the city of pillars, dreams hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult, and was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it, though the deathless Chinaman said that there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, which the initiated might read as they choose, especially the much-discussed couplet. There is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons, even death may die. And we're going to leave chapter 2 where this is, because we've still got another 2.5, 3 pages, and we're already at 35 minutes. So this is the end of part 1 of chapter 2. We will see you guys in the next one. I'm trying to cut these into 30 minutes because I know how it gets kind of untenable after that. Anyway, we will see you guys in the next one. My candle's about to go out. Look at this thing. The thing's about to go out. So, fun times. We will see you in the next one. You guys have a good one. Bye.